Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short, sharp session of 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name. I look forward to working with you in the next 30 minutes and talk about this very interesting topic of agility in teams. And I just wanted to give you a couple of heads up ways of looking at your team agility and what you can do to try and improve that, because it's always a frustration. And of course, this word agility is the new black. You know, we talk about it all the time, but what does it actually mean? And what are the dimensions of agility? Because obviously it can mean one thing to one team and another thing to another team. So we're going to have a look at that this morning and actually unpack that a little bit. So I'll just share my screen and then we'll get underway. Okay, so obviously this comes out of my latest book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And one of the characteristics, as you could probably imagine, is agility. So all high-performing teams are agile. They're able to maneuver quickly depending on their circumstances, the marketplace, the internal processes that they use. So yeah, all teams need to be agile. So some of you, of course, are dedicated viewers to my to these webinars. So pardon me, but for those of that are new, Tim Baker, I obviously a presenter. I'm an author. I've written 10 books, and of course, my latest book I've just mentioned. I also coach. I'm an executive coach, run workshops, and a whole range of other things in that whole space around education. And I also, as you can see up in the top right hand corner, still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, which is, as I often say, quite sad. But anyway, it is what it is. So let's move on and look at a couple of details. Now, the first thing I want to say is I received a lot of nice endorsements for my book from a range of different people. You can see there's some rugby legends who've made some very nice comments about the book, and also the current Commissioner of Police here in Queensland. So and then of course Nick Farr-Jones, who was a former Wallaby captain and great, gave me a very nice endorsement for my book as well. So that's all very nice. And what I want to do now is, in the book, I obviously can't talk about the whole book, and I don't intend to, but the backbone of the book really is that there are 8 characteristics of high-performing teams that I've identified. And as you can see on the right-hand side, one of those characteristics is to be agile. So what I'm going to focus on, of course, today is that whole notion of being agile. And we'll look at that in some detail in the short time we've got together. And of course, each of these other topics I do talk about during these short sessions on a Friday. Now, one of the objections that people have as a team leader, that, you know, they might think for themselves, well, there are so many rules and regulations in my organization, whether you're public sector, private sector, or not-for-profit, it's quite likely that you've got a pretty regulatory environment. And having that sort of environment does stifle agility. And so the question might be, how do I become more agile when I'm faced with these barriers that I have internally? And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But that's quite an understandable objection. And all teams are still working within a framework and a system, aren't they, in an organization? So therefore, they're beholden to the systems that the organization has and operates under. So the first model I want to share with you is the model of agility, where I have 7 dimensions of agility. Now, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to run through these dimensions with you. Now, while I'm going through this, I'd like you to do something for me. I'd like you to rate your team on a scale of 1 to 5. So in other words, if you rate your team a 5 on that dimension of agility, you're basically saying that we're doing that very well. On the other hand, if you rate it a 1, you're saying we've got a lot of improvement to make in that area. But basically, agility And when I first started writing this book, I thought, well, we're talking about agility, but what does it really mean? So what I decided to do is to put this model together on team agility and state that there are 7 types of agility. So what it basically means is that you may not be able to achieve all of these types of agility in your team, but of course, if you can't achieve any of them, we would probably suggest that you're not a very agile team. So as I go through these, and I'll start at the top and go clockwise and just talk about each one briefly, I just want you to think about your team and think, well, how are we doing as a team? You know, are we achieving this, or have we got room to maneuver or room to move in terms of improving our agility? So the very first, and of course, some of them are applicable to your team and other ones aren't. So that's another decision that you might like to think about. But at the end of the day, what I'm giving you here is a roadmap to be able to start to work on team agility and work out how you might do that. So the very first one, and these aren't necessarily in order of importance, but the very first type of agility is what we might call innovation. And that is, if you're in the business of producing services or products, how quickly you can get those services and products out to your customers in terms of new innovations is a form of agility. And of course, any organization that can put something out quickly in the marketplace that's new, it might be better, it might be faster, it might be easier, whatever it might be, it's likely that you're going to be able to get first market ownership. And the best example of that, and it's a little dated now, but we all remember touchscreen technology. When Apple developed touchscreen technology in the early stages, it was a really great innovation. And because Apple was the only provider that was able to do that, because they were the quickest to market, of course, the Apple shares skyrocketed because everybody wanted this touch screen technology. And now, of course, we know that everybody kind of has that technology. So what I'm defining innovation here is first to market. Now, if you're an internal service provider, that is, your team basically is there to service the needs of your organization, then you might consider agility, you might consider innovation in terms of, you know, changes in your methodology and the way you service your internal customers, and how quickly you can put the concept into practice. In other words, communicate that to the rest of the organization. So innovation, I think, is applicable to all teams, regardless of whether they're dealing with internal customers or external customers. So innovation is all about speed. At the end of the day, it's about how quickly you can get something into the marketplace, whether it's an internal market or an external market. Now, moving clockwise, the next one is processing speed. Now, this is the capacity to be able to get things processed in your team. And of course, we don't want to be cutting corners here. This isn't about, you know, having a process that's not really rigorous. We still want rigorous processes, and we still need rigorous processes. But how quickly can you process things? So, for example, when your team receives information from a source, and it's maybe an inquiry, or maybe you need to do something, or maybe you need to produce a report, or maybe you need to respond to something, how quickly is your team able to process that application or whatever it is that you receive? That's a form of agility. So how quickly, now that might require you to look at the steps or the stages involved in what's required, and maybe removing a stage or maybe adding a stage that might speed up the process. But again, just like innovation, processing is all about speed and how quickly you can respond to a need. And again, if you're an internal service provider, then obviously your customers are within the organization. And if you're an external provider, it's about processing things very quickly. Now, if you're in the private sector and you can process things faster than other organizations and still produce the same product or service, at the same price, then you've obviously got a competitive advantage. So for example, if it might be a home loan and you're looking for an application for a home loan, if you can actually process that paperwork fairly quickly without cutting corners, then clearly you're going to get an advantage in the marketplace, all things being equal. Now, the third form of agility is a very interesting one because this is the agility to recover from a mistake. What that basically means is that all of us make mistakes. All teams make mistakes. All individuals within teams make mistakes. And when your team makes a mistake, the question then is how quickly can your team recover from that mistake? Now, you might think, well, it depends on the mistake, and you're right. It can very much depend on the type of mistake that's made. But the question then, in terms of agility, is how quickly can you respond to that mistake? Now, if you've got a team where people are sort of hiding their mistakes or not owning up to what mistakes have been made, then that's a problem because that's going to take time. And then, we've got an investigation around who's done what, when, how, and so forth. So a culture of a team that's transparent and is open to accepting mistakes and responding to them quickly is a form of agility. For example, and it's an obvious example, but if you go to a restaurant, you order a meal, and let's say that, 15 minutes goes by and the meal is brought out to you and it's the wrong meal. So you ordered something completely different, and clearly the person taking the order had got it wrong. Now, if that case happened, then if the person went away very quickly after apologizing to you and organized your meal very promptly, that is the meal that you ordered, then you can be far more forgiving than you would, of course, if they were blaming you or they took too long to get that done. So recovery speed is critically important. So the interesting thing about innovation, processing, and recovery is that they're all based on speed. So those are three things that you might like to think about in terms of how you respond. So how quickly can you get the product out the door or the service? How quickly can you process a request? And how quickly can you recover from a mistake? So let's move on to number 4. Now, number 4 is an interesting one because it's continuous improvement. Now, all teams, all high-performing teams, whether they're in the sporting world or in business or wherever they are, there's another thing that they've all got in common. They're very good at continuously improving the way they do things. They're never complacent and they never accept the status quo for the sake of accepting it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is not part of the mantra of a high-performing team. So a high-performing team will constantly look at the way they do things and how they can be improved, whether it's the quality of the product or the service, whether it's the delivery, whether it's the speed, whether it's the safety, whatever it might be. Now, you might be saying, well, I understand that, Tim, but I don't know where to start. Let me give you a little tip on where to start if you're looking to improve your team's performance overall. Have a look at what you spend the majority of your time in as a team. Now, your team obviously probably achieves a certain function, whether it's internal or external, and look at what you do overall. So where do you spend the majority of your time? So if, for example, the majority of your time spent writing reports, then obviously that's the place to start, continuously improving. Because if report writing is your main activity, then if you can get a small percentage improvement in your reports, then it's going to make a major difference, isn't it? Because you're spending so much time on it. So the idea is, what business are you in? And then where do most of your team members spend the majority of their time? Once you've worked all that out, then you can spend a little bit of time focusing in on that activity or task and look at ways and means of doing it better, faster, easier, or whatever. Now, the very best way to do this is actually get your team involved. What I mean by that is that this should not just be your domain. You should really open this up for the team to work with you to look at ways and means of continuous improvement. So, for example, you might use one of your team meetings to put something on the table and to brainstorm with your team ways and means of doing that better, faster, easier, safer, whatever it might be. If you do that, then your time is well spent, assuming, of course, you put into practice what you've learned. And a lot of these improvements are not really time consuming or onerous. Part of the problem is finding the time to focus on them. So once you've found the time to focus on them, of course, it makes things a lot better and easier. Now, moving around, the next one is customer responsiveness. Now, we've all got customers. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we may have internal customers or we may have external customers. Perhaps we have both, but we've all got people who are end users of what we do. So if you're an internal service provider, then you will need to look at who you service within your organization. Of course, externally, the same thing. How can you improve the quality of the service that you provide and responsiveness, particularly responsiveness, which means that they become a priority? Because we all know, and we've all been on the receiving end of very, very, very poor service, or people have taken a long time to get back to us, or they haven't responded to us in a timely way. And that's very annoying, because we're all busy people. We all want our things done right now and we want them done immediately. So how good is your team at being customer responsive? Perhaps that might be a conversation that you have at one of your team meetings, to ask the team to rate your team's capacity to be customer responsive on a scale of 1 to 5. And if it's anything less than a 5, which I suspect it will be, then the question is, what can we do to get it to a 5? What do we need to do? And you'll notice the key word there is responsiveness. That is the capacity to respond to the needs and interests of the customer. That doesn't simply mean, of course, getting back to them via email quickly, although that would be a good start, but it might be about how you might make that a priority in your busy schedule. So that's a part of agility. Now, the next one, moving around the list, is problem solving. Now, how quickly is your team able to solve problems? And of course, it very much depends on what the problem is, whether it's a simple problem or a complex problem. But if it's a complex problem, how quickly is your team able to solve that problem? And the other question that I'd ask you is, how do you go about doing that? Do you go about doing that on your own as a team leader, or do you get your team members engaged in that process with you? Now, the problem with getting your team engaged in the process, of course, is it does take time, because you've got to down tools, you've got to meet, and you've got to talk about the problem and how you resolve it. But sometimes you might get a better result as well, because maybe several of the people in your team are actually engaged in that problem itself. So the trade-off is you might get a better result. However, it might take you a little longer to get done. But what I'm really looking at here is not so much speed as quality of solution. And I think if we're aiming for quality of solution, then it's probably likely that you should get your team members involved and engaged in that problem-solving exercise. So if you think about it, agility can mean and can involve problem solving as such. Now, the final one there, changing direction. What I've done here is, if you look at the other 6, they all have one thing in common, whether it's innovation, processing, recovery, continuous improvement, customer responsiveness, or problem solving. The one thing they've all got in common is it's about changing direction. So I decided to make the 7th one changing direction, which is a culmination of the other 6. So at the end of the day, if you said to me, what is the definition of team agility. I would say changing direction with, doing it quickly and effectively. That's to me the definition. And I put it in there because I wanted to make the point that all of those dimensions of agility are all about changing direction. So you might want to consider that as the key indicator of whether your team's agile or not. So rate them out of 5. And then what I'd suggest you do is to pick one of those, go back to your team and start working on it. And getting some small changes can make a big difference, as I'm sure you'd be aware. Now, the other thing I want to share with you before we finish up is a model of performance at work that you might be interested in coming out of my book. So if you look at the performance at work, there's 2 dimensions to it. There's the job focus and there's the non-job focus. Now, the job focus, of course, is in the job description. This is the technical role that people have. Now, I don't want to talk about that because obviously you're the experts in that regard, but clearly that is an important focus. Unfortunately, in many cases, it's the only focus. But I would suggest to you that there are a number of non-job roles that are critically important to be agile in your team. And if people aren't exercising the 4 non-job roles that I'm going to share with you, then it doesn't matter how much technical know-how they have, it's likely that your team's not going to be agile. So let's have a look at those. So one of the non-job roles that I think is fundamentally important. Now, remember, these non-job roles are not listed in the job description normally. So they are things that are important in terms of what you do in your team, but they're not necessarily part of the job dimension and written in the job description. But having a positive attitude and enthusiasm is critically important to any team. And I don't mean bouncing off the walls with excitement either. I'm talking about not whinging, whining, complaining, playing organisational politics and all the rest. All of that really slows down the potential for the team to change direction. The team role itself, we want people to be team players. And how often have we heard people say, well, I'm not a team player. I just come to work. I want to do my job. Well, in my view, that's non-negotiable. It is critically important that everybody in your team decides to adopt a team role. In other words, they're willing to be a team player. The third one there, the skill development role, really talks about the need to continually upgrade and develop one's skills. So I'd be expecting everyone in my team to be a lifelong learner. And if I found that someone wasn't, and let's face it, it's not as common practice as it would like, I would be wanting to have a conversation with them because they are slowing the team down by not adopting a new approach, or they're reluctant to adopt a new approach. Now, the 4th dimension there, or the 4th non-job role, is innovation and continuous improvement. The difference there is that the skill role is about the individual, whereas continuous improvement and innovation is about the team. So I want people to acknowledge that they have an important role to play in terms of helping the team become better, faster, safer, and all the rest. So I just wanted to share with you that concept before we finish up, because I think sometimes we spend too much time working on the technical role, when in actual fact, a lot of our problems and pitfalls in teams are actually non-job related. And yet those non-job dimensions or roles are critically important to a team's success, undoubtedly. Okay, so that's pretty much it for me. I just simply wanted to say that next week, and you might be aware, some of you, that every Friday I have a free webinar, just like today, on a different topic from one of my books. And I'm going to talk about from one of my books, my latest one actually, that's out in the 1st of November, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, Maximizing Performance Through Empowerment. I want to talk about proactive accountability in a crisis. So when we're in a crisis, or at least planning before we have a crisis, and this is topical obviously at the moment, how does one make sure that people know what their roles and responsibilities are so that they don't freeze in a crisis. And there's a nice balance between showing independent judgment and also following systems and processes that are required. So next Friday at 10 a.m., you are more than welcome to join, and there's the link. And when I send you the slides this afternoon, you can just click on that link and you can then go in and you register for that just as you've done today. So you're very welcome. And finally, I just say to you that if you like what you heard today and you'd like to get a copy of my book, I'm willing to give you a discount today, normally at $35, inclusive of postage. Today, I'm giving you a copy of my book for $25, inclusive of postage. And if you'd like to take advantage of that offer, all you've got to do is send me an email by the close of business today, and I will make sure that I sign the book for you and send it out, and you'll get your copy, I'm sure, very, very quickly. So I'll just stop sharing for a moment. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time. I hope you found some insight and use out of agility in teams and some of the ways that you can measure it, some of the things that you can do, and some of the opportunities that are open for you to consider that. Okay. So thanks, everyone. All the best and have a wonderful weekend. And hopefully I'll see you either next week or another Friday for another session. Thank you and goodbye.